Hello and welcome to the Art Journey. Today we're going to be working on a mini painting of an English cottage garden. We're going to be using the basics from 3 previous lessons, one on tall and short grasses, techniques for bushes and shrubs, and also a flower lesson that I put together. The stamp sets that I'm using come from the Art Impressions Company and include the flower set, foliage set, and the watercolor garden shed set. To get started on the English cottage garden, the first thing I did was go out to the internet and find some reference photos. This gives me the shapes of flowers, how they blend with the foliage, some basic patterns, and just an inspiration for how to get started. I've mounted the small garden shed from this Art Impressions set to the acrylic block. Using the number 45 sepia marker. I'm going to ink that up with the side of the marker. And because I want the garden and the foliage to be mostly in the foreground, I'm going to stamp my little garden shed more up here into the back. Now I go in with my number 4 watercolor brush. Get it nice and wet, and then tap it off. When you do a building, you want to go in and pull the color out of those lines into the flat sections of the building. Notice I'm not drawing down the center of the line. I'm taking my damp brush and I'm pulling that color into those areas. Notice that there's a broken area here on the top. That's because if the sun is overhead, that's typically the lightest area of the building. And so we can make it look like there's light shining on it if we leave that lighter and leave that line at the top a little lost. Much of this building is going to be covered over, so I'm not very worried about being very careful at this point. I want it to have a very hidden quality, much like this one does. Now, just as the doorway and window here is very dark, and I think provides a focal point for the garden, I want this window to be very dark as well. So I've taken number 86 African Violet. I've put a swatch of it on my palette. Now I can go in with water. Pull that color away with that wet brush and it creates a wash. Now, as soon as that is dry, I can go in and just put that wash right there in that window area. And I'm being careful not to touch those other lines, just in case they're still damp or wet. And that'll create that dark look. And I'm going to do the same thing here in this doorway. Whoops. And see what happens if you touch into it while that is still wet. It will actually bloom a little bit. And if this were a larger shed or something where I wasn't going to have the shed covered up, then I would probably start over, although that worked really well just to blot it away. Sometimes you can add a little bit of water. So I'm going to let that dry for just a minute before I continue. So the set that I'm going to be using for the foliage is number 4051. And I have my swatch cards here to give me an idea of what these grasses and bushes look like as I compare them to what I'm doing here. I see that there is a lot of good massed color here and here, more grass looking foliage there. This is just some kind of background, a little bit of grasses. So this will give me the idea of where I can use these stamps and which technique in order to create that look. So I'm going to start out with that more triangular shape. I'm going to think about a path coming in through here so that this foliage and these grasses and these flowers will be larger and more defined, and they'll get smaller and less defined as I go back. Now I'm going to use the technique of inking the stamp and stamping it multiple times in order to get the variation in foliage. As I move back, I ink just the top of the stamp in order to get the foliage smaller. Now I've placed a mask over the top of the cottage, which will protect it as I stamp around it. And I continue that process until I fill up the space I want with the foliage. Now out of the same set, I'm going to pick the shrub that looks more like a bush with larger leaves. These make great trees in the background. I'm using number 72 pine green, and I'm going to stamp that above the bushes toward the back. And also behind the cottage, and with the mask there, it makes those trees look like they're behind the cottage. And I'll stamp those in several places to get a good tree line in the back. Now I'm going to use the tall grasses and also the short grasses from the same set to create a different type of foliage in this garden. I'm going to ink up these stamps with a different color this time. I'm using number 15 olive green. Ink up the larger grasses and stamp them in the front. Remember those tall grasses in the front of my reference photo. Things closer to you appear larger and more distinct, and as grasses and shrubbery move back and away from you, they begin to look less bright, less distinct, and they appear smaller. So that will give you perspective when you're creating a mini painting. I'm also leaving an area there open so that I can get the feeling of a path when I get to that point in the painting. And I keep doing this until I get the feel, the look that I want with those grasses. Now I go ahead and with a slightly dampened brush, go in and soften all of these green lines. The areas where I want the watercolor pigment to bloom just a little bit more, I add more water here in these distant trees behind the cottage. And then as I come forward, my brush tends to be a little more dry, which allows more distinct lines to show, and it gives a little bit more definition, again, as we move forward. So I'm softening those edges just the way they would appear if I squinted down and looked at a scene like this from a distance. Those tree branches up high and behind the cottage are going to be soft. Just a hint of those clumps of leaves. And then as we get closer, I'm going to be able to see more and more detail and more definition. And again, I can vary the amount of water depending on what it is I want the effect to be. And you can see how that as that dries, I get that very loose line of that back row of foliage. I like it when my watercolor blooms and kind of goes out of my control a little bit. Down here in the front, I'm pulling those grasses in the direction that they grow, and they're very much more defined than the grasses that I'm doing now in the back. I'm still giving them the same direction, but they're softer. I've used a little more water. Don't want to see those blades quite as well in the back as I do in the front. I'm leaving some open areas so that we can go back in and add flowers without worry of getting them mixed in with the green. Now I've put a swatch of green on my palette. I've watered it down to create a wash, and I'm going in and just filling in those big open areas, making sure I don't go under my mask, and I'm getting those green grassy areas, as you can see in that picture. Now I'm going to remove the mask, and you can see that little halo area out around the cottage. So now I'm going to go in with more African violet from my palette that's been watered down slightly and darken those dark areas, which is much easier to do now that the rest of the cottage has dried. I have less risk getting that purple mixed in with the brown and having it bloom if the cottage is dry. I'm also going to go under the eave where there would be shade, there on the front of the building and also on the side where the window is. It just creates a little bit more realism and depth and feeling for where the light is coming from. Now I'm going to go in and add some flowers. And I've decided to start with the lily stamp. And I'm going to begin by stamping these in number 80 Victorian Rose. I think that's a close approximation to what I see in that reference photo. And I'm going to stamp just the lily part, the flowers. At this point, I'm not going down on that stem very much. I don't think there's a need to see very many stems when you have a garden that's so tightly planted as these English country gardens are. So I'm going in again. These lilies will really be defined in the front of the painting. Now I'm going to go in and add more clumps of flowers. I'm using the small daisy stamp from the floral set, and I'm inking it in number 20 magenta. And I'm going to put those clusters of flowers back there around that cottage, just as I saw in the photo. I'm also going to bring them forward into the front areas of the painting, and because I left some of those white spaces, I can keep them away from the green, and that makes it less likely that when I soften them down I'll end up with mud or gray. So it's a good idea to think about leaving those white spaces when you can. I like the idea of pulling the color into all areas of the painting, so what I use in the back I will also use in the front and on both sides. Now I'm going to go in and create a little bit of variety by using a tall flower and a very different color. I'm going in with number 86 African Violet and stamping those at different heights to create tall interest in that garden. In the front, I ink the entire stamp so I get the tallest version of the flower. And then as I move back toward the cottage, I ink only the tip in order to make it appear that those flowers are getting shorter as we go back into the background. And now I'm going to go in and create even more interest by using a different variety of flower stamped in a brilliant yellow. I'm going to stamp some of these vertically in the foreground to make them appear larger. And then when I move into the background, I'm going to turn it horizontally to get that feel and look that the flowers are shorter and closer to the ground to help with my perspective as I move back on both sides of the path. Now I'm going to go in with a damp brush, a little bit of water that I have tapped off on my chamois, and I'm doing the lilies first, and I like to put less water on these lilies because I like to maintain the shape and feel of that particular flower. Then I'll go in and do the next daisy style. Again, just as with the trees, more water will cause them to be more fuzzy, they'll bloom out a little bit, and up close in the front, the way I hold my brush and using slightly less water makes those daisies more defined. And I can see them in more detail, which again helps with my perspective. I'm also going to go in and soften those tall, blue, spiky flowers. It could be delphiniums. In the back, they'll be a bit softer, and as I come toward the front, I'll leave a little bit more of that detail to create the perspective and the interest. Now I'm feeling that there's a little brightness that needs to come into the painting if I'm going to make it look like the reference photo. So I'm taking that original branch and I'm inking it up in a brighter, warmer jungle green, and I'm stamping it up there in the corner just the way the sunlight came through the trees in my reference photo, and also back in that back line of bushes and trees. I'll put the mask back on and stamp some around that front side where the light may have been shining through. And remember, anytime you get something that has bloomed too much and you want to add more detail after it's dried, you can go in and do that. So now I'm going in that final layer and I'm adding some of those red blooms on top of that area on the cottage that seemed to bloom out too much and lose its definition. And I'll put some of those red blossoms down over the top. Have to be careful if I'm getting them close to that green, because when I go in to soften and make that, add that water, if I get red and green too close to each other, they will bloom out and make mud. And that's happened more often than I'd like to think about when I've done these. So it takes practice. Don't be discouraged if it happens to you. The next step is to go in with a damp brush and pull the color from those brighter, lighter areas that we just stamped to create that sunlight in those trees up on the right and to the right side of the cottage garden where the light will be hitting. I'm also going to go in and soften those red dots for that other layer of flowers. There along the path. And again, they look the most vivid in those areas where I've been successful in leaving white open areas. Now here's a little detail you may or may not want to try. I want to get those window panes in, so I'm using the fine tip of the African violet marker to just lightly sketch in those window panes. Now I'm going to use the sepia, put a swatch on my palette, make a wash with a lot of water, and this will be my path. So I'm putting that wash onto the path. Notice that I am using horizontal strokes to pull that color across the path from up near the cottage closer to the front. And those strokes should always stay horizontal to give you a more realistic feel. And your path should get wider as it comes closer to you. Remember that when this dries, it will be a slightly different color. So start light. You can always go back in and add more color. Our last wash will be out of sky blue, and this will be for the sky. So I put the swatch on my palette, I add water, and now there's one more step for the sky. I go in and I paint the sky with water, staying away from the edge of the foliage and the building, and now drop that loose wash of color into the area that I painted with water. And that gives me that light sky blue color and keeps it from blending into the bushes and the trees or the buildings so they don't touch. I hope you enjoyed painting the cottage garden. Please subscribe if you'd like to see future videos, and look forward to next time.